1934, Argentina. Entire family frozen while holding hands. It began with the wind. Not a storm. Not even a warning. Just a soft hiss that rolled through the trees like breath over glass. By midnight, the sound had changed. It was sharper now, colder, cutting through the dark streets of San Pedro, a quiet riverside town in Argentina where winter rarely bit this hard. People woke to the sound of shutters rattling, animals crying, and something else, a distant cracking, like the slow fracture of bone beneath ice. No one knew it then, but the night the wind changed would mark the last breath of an entire family. The Villalbas were well known in town. Quiet, kind, church-going people. Juan Villalba worked at the grain mill by the river. His wife, Estela, ran a small bakery from their home. They had 3 children, Mateo, age 12, Ana, 9, and baby Clara, barely 2. That evening, October 4th, 1934, they'd gone for a walk by the river. It was something they did often, to watch the sunset fade into the water. Neighbors saw them laughing, holding hands, wrapped in scarves against a mild chill. Nothing seemed strange, but as darkness fell, the wind turned violet. By 9 p.m., the temperature had dropped nearly 20 degrees. The dogs grew restless. The church bell, never rung after sunset, began to sway and moan in the wind. No one saw the Villalbas return home. By morning, the world outside looked as if it had been dipped in glass. The river had frozen overnight, completely solid. Fishermen stood at the banks, stunned. The water hadn't frozen in living memory. Even the reeds were entombed in crystal stillness. The town doctor, old Dr. Sosa, stepped outside his clinic and found frost crawling up the window from inside. Whispered, "Esto no es normal." This is not normal. And he was right. The freeze had no pattern, no reason, only a silence that pressed against the chest like grief itself. At the Villalba house, the fire had long since died. Bread sat half-kneaded on the kitchen table, a chair overturned. But there were no signs of struggle, just absence. The neighbors thought perhaps they'd gone to stay with Estela's sister in San Nicolas. But when a telegraph arrived that afternoon confirming they never arrived, dread settled over the town. By sunset, a small search party formed. Men with lanterns and ropes trudged toward the riverbank, their boots cracking the frozen soil. The light from their lanterns flickered weakly, as though reluctant to reveal what lay ahead. The river was an eerie sight, a white, unbroken sheet stretching across the valley. The sky had turned the color of pewter, and even the birds had gone silent. The men fanned out, calling the families names, their voices dull against the still air. Then someone shouted. Near a bend in the river, where the water once ran deep, the ice was oddly shaped, like something had been caught in motion beneath it. The surface shimmered with faint contours, almost like hands. The men leaned closer, and in that moment, under the thin veil of ice, they thought they saw faces. Eyes, mouths frozen open, as if mid-prayer. The lantern dropped. Someone screamed. The ice cracked slightly, a soft groan echoing through the valley, and then silence returned, heavier than before. By the time dawn rose again, the town was gathered by the river. The priest clutched his cross. The mayor whispered orders no one wanted to follow. And beneath their boots, the ice seemed alive, whispering secrets only the dead could understand. That morning, the papers would later say, San Pedro stopped breathing. But for now, only one question haunted the air. How could a family freeze solid in a single night, when the sky had not even snowed? The Villalba house stood at the corner of Calle Belgrano, a small clay-colored home with vines that once bloomed white in spring. By dawn on October 5th, it looked abandoned. The curtains fluttered through a broken window, and frost traced the shape of a child's hand against the glass. Neighbors had waited all night for the family's return. Lamps burned in windows along the street. A few of them, the blacksmith's wife, old Senora Torres, swore they'd heard laughter near midnight. Children's laughter. But when they stepped outside to listen closer, it vanished into the cold. At sunrise, When the first light spilled across the empty streets, it was clear no one had come home. Juan Villalba's employer, Don Ricardo, arrived early that morning. One had never missed a shift in 12 years. He found the bakery door ajar, the smell of half-baked bread still faint in the air. On the kitchen counter lay Estella's apron, stiff with frost. Upstairs, the children's beds were neatly made. Clara's toy lamb sat propped beside her pillow. Everything was in its place, as if the family had simply stepped out for a walk and would return any moment. But the clock had stopped. Literally. The small brass timepiece on the mantel was frozen at 9:42 p.m. By noon, word had spread across San Pedro. The mayor ordered a town-wide search, something unheard of for such a small place. Men gathered with shovels, ropes, and axes, while women carried blankets and holy water. Father Nunez led a short prayer in front of the Villalba house, his breath turning to smoke in the frigid air. The first group to reach the riverbank was led by a man named Eusebio Ramirez, a retired soldier known for his stubborn courage. He was the first to step onto the frozen surface, tapping the ice with a walking stick. Strong enough, he muttered, unaware that below him lay the answer to the town's growing dread. A few yards ahead, Eusebio found footprints, small, delicate ones. A child's. They trailed toward the center of the river, spaced evenly, as if walking calmly. But halfway across, they simply stopped. No slide marks, no scuffle, just an end. He crouched down and pressed his palm to the ice. Beneath the glassy surface, something faintly glimmered. Fabric, maybe? A ribbon? He called for help. When others joined him, they saw it too. A frozen strand of blue cloth that looked like the hem of a dress. Estella's dress. By evening, a crowd had gathered near the bend where the river curved back toward the fields. The townsfolk kept their distance, whispering prayers. The wind carried a strange hum, a hollow vibration that rose from the ice whenever someone spoke too loudly. The doctor arrived, clutching his bag, face pale. He ordered the men to stop breaking the surface. If they're down there, he said, we must extract them carefully. But when the first sheet of ice was lifted, a sudden mist poured out, cold enough to sting their faces. And through that fog, they saw what none of them could explain, outlines of bodies, perfectly preserved, as if time itself had halted. 5 of them, kneeling, hands intertwined. The sight made even the strongest men fall silent. That night, no one slept. Children cried. Dogs barked at nothing. In the tavern, the men argued about what to do next, wait for the authorities, or break the rest of the ice to retrieve the bodies. But when the mayor wired Buenos Aires for assistance, the line went dead. Not once, but 3 times. And then, around midnight, the temperature rose again, just enough for the ice to moan and shift. Some swore they heard voices under the river, calling softly, almost singing. By morning, the wind had stopped. The air felt heavy, damp, and still. And from that stillness, only one truth remained. The Villalbas had vanished, but the town of San Pedro had just begun to feel their presence. At first light, the men returned to the river, carrying shovels and picks now rimed with frost. Overnight, a thin mist had crept over the valley, curling low around the trees like breath from the earth itself. It was silent, unnaturally silent. Even the birds that nested near the docks were gone. They began to follow the trail again, those strange, lonely footprints. The men moved slowly, lanterns swaying in the dull morning light. The tracks were clear, 5 sets. Juan's heavy boots, Estella's smaller prints, and 3 sets of bare feet, the children. Mateo's steps were wide and sure. Anna's danced in half steps beside him. And little Clara's? Tiny, unsteady, yet perfectly visible. Each mark pressed into the frozen soil, like a signature of innocence. But what unnerved them most was the order. They weren't scattered. They weren't running. They were walking, calmly, side by side, until the trail reached the water's edge. And there, in the smooth white of the frozen river, the prince simply stopped. Eusebio Ramirez crouched again, running his gloved fingers along the last visible print. It ends here, he said quietly. No drag marks. No cracks leading forward. Nothing. It was as if the family had walked straight into the air and vanished. Someone behind him whispered, Dios los tomo. God took them. Another man crossed himself, but Eusebio wasn't convinced. He knew cold. He'd fought in the mountains during the Great War. He'd seen frostbite, avalanches, frozen rivers, but nothing like this. Ice didn't form overnight like glass. Not in this part of Argentina. Not in October. The doctor arrived again, his eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep. No one touches the ice until I say, he ordered. Whatever happened here, it's not natural. The mayor, trembling behind him, nodded quickly. The authorities are on their way from Buenos Aires. They'll bring equipment. We wait. But that night, the authorities didn't come. Instead, a storm rolled in, not of snow or rain, but of wind and sound. It swept down from the hills in sudden, violent bursts. People swore they heard it speaking, a low, mournful cry that carried through the valley. And with every gust, the river seemed to move beneath the ice, as if something alive was shifting below. By morning, the footprints were gone, completely. The wind had erased them, scouring the riverbank smooth. Only Eusebio had thought to draw their path on a map before they vanished. When he brought it to the church later that day, Father Nunez studied it carefully, eyes narrowing. Their last steps form a circle, he whispered. Not a path. A circle around the bend. Eusebio frowned. A circle? The priest nodded. A symbol of prayer or a warning. That afternoon, the men tried to reach the bodies again. They struck at the ice with axes, careful but desperate. The surface was strangely resilient, thicker than before. It sounded hollow, almost metallic when struck. Every blow echoed back like thunder. Then, just as they were about to stop, something surfaced. Not a body, but a small object trapped near the top of the ice. A ribbon, pale blue, tangled around a lock of golden hair. Anna's hair. The doctor turned away, trembling. They were standing right here, he said softly. But why the hands? Why together like that? No one answered. Because none of them could admit what they all felt. The Villalbas hadn't simply frozen. They had chosen to hold on, together, as if facing something they refused to face alone. That night, the townsfolk locked their doors. Candles burned until dawn. And though no one dared approach the river again, they could all hear it. Faint cracks echoing through the night, like footsteps returning to the water. When dawn came, the mist had thickened once more, and the air held a strange smell, something sweet, almost floral, drifting from the frozen bend. It was as if the earth itself was remembering them. When the rescue team from Buenos Aires finally arrived 3 days later, the town was already unraveling. San Pedro, once a place of laughter and gossip over warm bread, had turned into a hushed congregation of faces pressed to windows, watching the river that no longer flowed. The team came with heavy coats, ropes, chisels, and scientific authority, but none of that prepared them for what waited beneath the ice. They began at sunrise. The first strike of the pickaxe rang through the valley like a church bell. The ice cracked reluctantly, splitting in long, elegant lines that glimmered under the pale light. It took hours to break through the first layer. When they did, the air that escaped was bitter and sharp, carrying the faint smell of lilacs. It shouldn't have smelled like anything at all. One of the workers gagged. Another muttered a prayer under his breath. And then, through the steam of their breath and the mist rising from the wound in the eyes, they saw them. The Villalbas. They weren't scattered or collapsed. They were together, kneeling, heads bowed, hands clasped tightly as if in worship. Juan's arm was around Estella's shoulders, her cheek pressed to his chest. The children were in front of them, Anna clutching Clara, Mateo's small hand gripping his father's coat. Their faces were calm, peaceful, not contorted in fear or pain, just still. A hush fell over everyone. The sound of chisels stopped. The priest whispered, frozen in prayer, and that's what they were. The scientists didn't know what to make of it. They measured the ice's thickness, nearly 20 inches. Impossible for a single night. The temperatures that week hadn't dropped low enough, not even close. Yet here they were, perfectly preserved as if sealed by time itself. Dr. Sosa, the town physician, stood back, trembling. "Look at their faces," he said. "No struggle, no panic. They must have seen something that made them kneel." No one spoke after that. When they finally lifted the bodies from the ice, they remained frozen solid, the fingers still entwined, the smallest child's hand fused to her sister's. The men laid them on sheets near the riverbank, the frost glistening on their skin like fine sugar. Someone tried to separate the hands to wrap them individually, but the priest stopped him. "No," he said softly. "Let them stay as they were. Whatever took them, they faced it together." The townspeople gathered in silence, watching as their neighbors, once flesh and laughter, now lay like marble figures carved by grief itself. But what unsettled everyone most wasn't the way they looked. It was the way the ice had shaped itself around them. Perfectly. The scientists noticed that the ice didn't simply encase them. It grew around them, following the shape of their bodies, their clothes, their clasped fingers. Like something intelligent had sculpted it. That night, the bodies were placed in the church for the wake. Father Nunez lit candles that flickered violently despite the still air. As he prayed, the flame closest to Clara's face bent toward her, as though drawn by something unseen. The priest paused mid-sentence. His hand trembled as he made the sign of the cross. Outside, the temperature dropped again. The windows began to frost over. By midnight, the church itself was wrapped in a thin layer of ice. The candles burned blue, and in the silence of that frozen chapel, witnesses claimed they heard a faint sound coming from the altar, a whisper, soft and rhythmic, like the echo of children praying. When dawn came, the ice on the church walls melted as quickly as it had formed. The candles were still lit, but the cross above the altar, the one that had hung there for 100 years, had cracked down the center, and no one could explain why. The photographs should have been simple documentation, nothing more. At least, that's what Alvaro Medina believed when he arrived from Buenos Aires with his wooden camera and tripod, his hands stiff from a cold. He had been hired by the provincial government to record what they called the San Pedro incident. To him, it was just another assignment. He'd photographed floods, fires, even a train derailment once. But this was different. The moment he stepped off the carriage, he felt it. That stillness. The air here didn't move like normal air. It pressed down, heavy and watchful. When he reached the church, the Villalbas lay in the center aisle beneath white sheets, lit by the flicker of dozens of candles. The scent of melted wax mingled with something faintly floral, that same impossible lilac smell the others had noticed at the river. Alvaro set up his camera slowly. He didn't speak. No one did. When the first flash ignited, several villagers gasped. The light washed across the pews, revealing faces pale with grief and something else. Fear. He adjusted his lens and took another photograph, focusing on the clasped hands of the family. Through the glass, he saw something strange. Tiny fractures, almost like frost patterns, forming along their skin. When he blinked, they were gone. He shook his head, assuming it was the cold. But the unease lingered. That night, Alvaro developed the plates in the rectory behind the church. He worked in silence, surrounded by the chemical scent of collodion and the slow drip of water. When the first image emerged beneath the red lamplight, he froze. In the photograph, the Villalbas appeared as expected, serene, frozen, still holding hands. But in the background, just beyond the church doors, there was something, a shadow. Tall, thin, standing where no one had been during the exposure. Alvaro stared, convinced it was an error. He checked the plate again. The shadow remained. He developed the second image. The same figure. Closer this time, its shape blurred, as if moving toward the camera. His pulse quickened. He turned to the window. Outside, the churchyard was empty. The candles had burned low. He could hear the wind faintly brushing against the stained glass. But as he leaned closer to the final plate, something inside the darkroom shifted. A sound, like knuckles rapping gently on the wooden door behind him. He turned fast. Nothing. Only the dripping tap, the hum of the lamp. Still, the feeling wouldn't leave him, that someone or something was standing just behind the thin curtain of darkness. By morning, Alvaro packed his camera and told the priest he had all he needed. He didn't stay for the burial. He didn't say goodbye. When he returned to Buenos Aires, he submitted only one photograph, the most ordinary of the set, showing the family without the shadow. The rest he hid away. For decades, no one knew what he'd seen that night. But in 1963, when Alvaro died, his nephew inherited his belongings, including a locked chest marked simply San Pedro. Inside were the glass negatives, wrapped in newspaper so old it crumbled to dust. Every single photo showed the same thing: the Villalbas frozen in prayer, and that tall, featureless shadow creeping closer frame by frame, until in the final image it stood directly behind them, hands stretched outward, almost touching their heads. The nephew burned the photos the next morning. But he couldn't burn the memory of what he saw in the reflection of the glass, the faint outline of 5 smaller figures standing beside him, watching in silence. Long before the freeze, before the Villalbas vanished, there had been one man who tried to warn San Pedro. His name was Emilio Duarte, a farmer who lived alone on the high ridge overlooking the valley. People said he spoke little, prayed often, and drank more than both combined. Most dismissed his talk as the ramblings of a man haunted by solitude. But on the night of October 4th, 1934, Emilio saw something no one else did, and it would torment him until the day he died. He had been repairing a fence before dusk when the wind shifted. The cattle began to bawl and press against the wooden posts, eyes wide and rolling. The air smelled strange, not earthy, not stormy, but metallic. Then came the sound, a low vibration, deep and continuous, like 1,000 voices humming under the ground. Emilio looked toward the valley, and there it was, a white wall, rising from the river, swallowing everything in its path. Not fog, not snow, something denser. He described it later as light that moved like water. He ran for his cabin, slamming the shutters as the light surged up the hillside. The walls groaned, the roof rattled. The air turned thick, heavy, cold enough to sting his lungs. He fell to his knees, clutching a crucifix, whispering prayers he hadn't spoken in years. Then silence. A silence so complete he thought he'd gone deaf. When he opened his eyes, everything outside was white. The trees, the fields, even the air shimmered like crystal. And down in the valley, the river no longer flowed. The next morning, when he stumbled into town to tell what he'd seen, people laughed at first. But when they followed his gaze to the valley and saw the frozen river for themselves, their laughter died. Still, no one believed his story about the light. They called it the storm of the century and moved on. But after the Villalbas were found, people started whispering. Maybe that wall took them. Maybe they walked into it. And that's when Emilio stopped talking, stopped coming down from his ridge. He'd said his piece, and no one wanted to hear it again. Years later, in 1951, Emilio was found dead in his cabin, sitting upright in his chair, cup of mate still beside him. The fire had gone out. The window was open. Outside, it hadn't snowed in months, yet the ground around his home was covered in a thin sheet of frost. On the table beside him lay a single page torn from his journal, the ink faded but legible. It came again last night. Not snow, not light. I heard the voices this time, calling from the river. They sound like children. After his death, locals avoided the ridge altogether. Even hikers who ventured near said the air grew colder there, inexplicably so. Some swore they could hear faint singing when the wind turned east, the same direction where the river still glimmered under layers of sediment and silt. The story of Emilio Duarte became a ghost tale told by fishermen, a warning shared by parents. Don't go near the bend after dark. But when archaeologists later dug near his property in the 1980s, hoping to confirm soil patterns of the 1934 anomaly, they found something else. Beneath the frost in the hardened clay were footprints, 5 small ones, perfectly preserved, and they led straight toward the edge of the ridge, where nothing should have stood but air. No one could explain how those prints had survived 50 years. No one wanted to, because everyone in San Pedro already knew the family that froze by the river had walked through something that wasn't meant for this world. By late winter, the bodies had been buried, the photographs sealed away, and the newspapers stopped printing stories about San Pedro. But the river refused to forget. Even after months of thaw, the bend where the Villalbas were found never melted completely. The ice remained pale, glassy, unmoving. Fishermen avoided it. Cattle refused to drink near it. And at night, when the moon hit it just right, it shimmered faintly as though something beneath was trying to breathe. Children whispered that if you stood by the frozen bend and closed your eyes, you could hear them, the family praying. Some claimed to have heard laughter instead. Others crying. The adults dismissed it all, but they didn't dare go near the spot themselves. The town doctor, Dr. Sosa, however, couldn't let it go. Science, he said, demanded explanation. He began visiting the river every week, collecting ice samples and recording temperatures. Yet what he found made less and less sense. The ice was warm beneath the surface, only by a few degrees, but enough to contradict every law of nature. And then there were the sounds. When pressed to his ear, the ice whispered. Not wind, not shifting cracks, whispers. He wrote in his notes. It is the sound of words without meaning, or perhaps too much meaning for the human ear. In late November, during one of his final visits, Sosa decided to melt a small fragment in his lab. He placed the shard in a glass bowl and set it by the stove. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then, a faint hiss. The air grew colder, not warmer. Frost crawled along the windows from the inside. And just as the ice turned to water, something moved inside it. It was brief, a ripple, almost like a hand pressing up from beneath the surface. Then it was gone. The doctor stumbled backward, heart racing. When he returned to the bowl moments later, the water was gone, evaporated completely, leaving only a thin white residue that smelled faintly of lilacs. That night, he didn't sleep. He heard knocking on his windows every few hours, 3 taps, soft, deliberate. By morning, the panes were rimmed with frost, each marked by a single handprint, 5 of them, arranged in a circle. He sealed his notes in an envelope and brought them to Father Nunez the next day. I'm done, he told him. It's not the ice that's unnatural, it's what's inside it. The priest read the papers in silence, then locked them away in the church basement. But in the years that followed, he would often wake in the middle of the night, swearing he heard that same whispering, faint but persistent, rising from the river valley. Decades passed. The town grew quieter, poorer. The river shifted course slightly, as rivers do, but the bend remained frozen, a smooth white scar in the earth. When tourists came through, locals warned them not to step near it. Bad ground, they'd say, the kind that remembers. One winter, a pair of geologists camped nearby, hoping to study the soil composition. On their 3rd night, they were awakened by a sound like singing, distant and childlike, echoing across the valley. They followed it toward the river, flashlights cutting through the fog. The temperature dropped the closer they came. When they reached the edge of the bend, they saw it. 5 faint shapes beneath the ice, blurred but unmistakable. The moment one of them touched the surface, the singing stopped. And from deep within the ice, something answered. A single, hollow breath, like the exhale of a long-buried world. The next morning, their tent stood empty. Their equipment was found half buried in frost. On one of the cameras recovered from the site, the last photo taken showed only a blur of white and, faintly, 5 small handprints pressed against the lens. Even now, locals say that when the wind turns cold enough, you can hear them again, those whispers in the ice, murmuring through the valley. Some say it's the family praying still. Others say it's the river itself, asking to be left alone. By 1941, 7 years after the tragedy, San Pedro had grown quieter, smaller somehow, as if the very soul of the town had been hollowed out and left to freeze along the riverbank. The bakery never reopened. The Villalba home remained locked, its windows boarded, ivy crawling up the walls like veins on old skin. And Father Nunez, the town's priest, had begun to lose his mind. He still performed Mass each Sunday, though fewer came. He spoke slower now, eyes distant, hands trembling when he lifted the chalice. Some said it was age. Others whispered it was guilt, because on his deathbed that winter, Father Nunez revealed something that no one, not even his closest confidants, had ever heard before. It began the night of the wake in 1934. After the villagers left the church and the candles dimmed, Nunez stayed behind to pray over the Villalba's bodies. He'd heard stories of souls that linger, and if any deserved peace, it was this family. He knelt before the altar, whispering prayers in Latin. But as the words filled the air, a chill ran through the church. The last candle flickered, sputtered, then went out. He froze. The silence pressed in. And then, from behind him, a soft sound. It wasn't footsteps. Not exactly. It was more like the shift of ice, the delicate crackle of frozen wood under pressure. He turned slowly. The moonlight through the stained glass revealed the outlines of the 5 figures lying in the center aisle. Except they weren't lying flat anymore. Their hands, those pale, intertwined hands, were moving, ever so slightly. Nunez wanted to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. He clutched the crucifix around his neck, trembling. The fingers of the eldest child, Mateo, seemed to twitch, curling and uncurling. Estela's lips parted, just enough to let a wisp of vapor escape, like breath. Then came the whisper, so soft, he almost thought he imagined it. It's still in the river. The priest stumbled backward, knocking over a candlestick. The sound broke whatever trance had filled the air. The bodies lay still again, motionless, silent. But the voice lingered, not in his ears, but in his mind. It's still in the river. For years afterward, Nunez carried that secret. He prayed more, spoke less. He convinced himself it was exhaustion, shock, grief. But the voice returned in his dreams, always the same, a calm, childlike whisper warning him not to go near the water. And yet, in 1938, he did. One foggy morning, he walked to the bend alone, clutching his rosary. The river was still half frozen, though it hadn't snowed in weeks. He stood at the edge, muttering prayers, waiting for something. Then he saw it, a shape beneath the surface. Long, slender, moving slowly against the current. It wasn't a log. It moved upstream. And as it passed, the ice above it cracked in perfect concentric circles, like ripples spreading through glass. Nunez fell to his knees. The whisper returned, louder now, carried by the wind. Don't look. He obeyed. He fled, and he never set foot near the river again. When he finally confessed the story on his deathbed in 1941, his final words chilled the nurse who recorded them. He didn't speak of demons or miracles. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply said, they weren't praying. They were holding it down. Moments later, his breath clouded in the warm air, just once, and then stopped. After his passing, the church locked his confessional journal away. But some years later, a young curate read it and quietly left San Pedro before dawn, never to return. And ever since that day, whenever the fog rolls low across the valley, people say they see 5 faint shapes kneeling in the mist, always by the same frozen bend, praying still, or perhaps holding the river closed. It wasn't until 1968, more than 3 decades after the Villalba's deaths, that the truth began to thaw, not through rumor or witness, but through words written by the dead. A construction crew had been repairing a road that ran near the Villalba property when one of the workers' shovels struck something solid buried beneath the packed soil, a small tin box rusted shut. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and yellowed lace, was a leather-bound diary. The name pressed into its cover, still faintly legible beneath the grime, read, Clara Villalba, 1933. Clara was the youngest daughter, only 12 when she died. Her handwriting was delicate, looping, innocent. But as the pages went on, the tone changed, trembling between childhood wonder and quiet terror. At first, her entry spoke of the simple joys of a family in the Argentine countryside, the smell of bread baking at dawn, her father's habit of humming old Spanish hymns while repairing the fence, her mother, Lucia, braiding her hair before church. Then, somewhere around late July, the light in her words dimmed. "Papa says the river sings at night now," she wrote. "But it's not a song I like. It sounds like someone knocking far below." The following pages were smudged, as if from damp fingers. She mentioned seeing fog when there was no cold, and hearing her mother whisper prayers she didn't understand, prayers not found in any Bible. "Mama says we mustn't look at the water when it shines blue," one entry read. She says if we pretend not to see it, it will go away again. There was another entry, dated August 12th, 1934, the day before the freeze. The handwriting was frantic, letters jagged, uneven. "It's under the house now. I heard it last night. Papa said not to tell the others. He says the river has taken something from us, and it wants it back. We're going tomorrow to pray together by the bend. He says we must hold hands and not let go, no matter what we hear." The final page was torn, but across the faint lines, one last message remained: "If we don't come back, don't open the river." When historians examined the diary, they were divided. Some believed Clara had simply been an imaginative child, frightened by the strange weather patterns that year. Whispers of an early frost, gases rising from underground streams. But others, especially locals, refused to dismiss it. Because in 1968, the year the diary was found, the river froze again. Not fully, just a thin crust of ice on the surface in the middle of summer. And beneath it, fishermen swore they saw something moving, something pale, drifting just below. The diary was sent to Buenos Aires for preservation, but within months it disappeared from the archive entirely. The official record lists it as misplaced. Yet a man who claimed to have handled it during cataloging said that before the diary vanished, its ink had begun to fade, as if erased by moisture from within the pages. He remembered one thing clearly, though: the smell. When he opened the final page, the faint scent of river water rose from it. Cold, metallic, impossible to forget. Clara's words became the heartbeat of San Pedro's legend. Each retelling added a new layer: that she'd been the first to see it, that she'd tried to warn her parents, that she'd written more pages than were found. But no one could agree on what it was. A spirit? A punishment? Something buried beneath the current long before the town existed? All they knew was this: the diary ended the same way the Villalbas did, with silence, frost, and a promise that something beneath the river still waited to rise. Decades later, long after most had forgotten the tragedy, a drought would expose what the water had hidden. The ice would melt, the riverbed would dry, and with it would come the final revelation. It was the summer of 2014, one of the hottest on record in northern Argentina. The San Pedro Valley had not seen rain for nearly 8 weeks. The once violent river that had carved the town's history was now reduced to a shallow trickle, its stones cracked, its bed exposed for the first time in living memory. By then, most people had forgotten the name Villalba. The story was just that: an old legend, a whispered ghost tale passed between generations who no longer believed in the cold. But when the river finally receded, the land remembered. It began with the children. A group of local boys, playing near the dry banks, stumbled upon something pale glinting in the mud. At first, they thought it was driftwood, until one of them touched it, and the surface gave way with a sound like splitting glass. Underneath was ice, in 40-degree heat. Word spread quickly. By evening, half the town stood by the riverbed, watching as men dug around the spot. The deeper they went, the colder it got, their breath visible in the sweltering air. One worker swore he heard faint tapping coming from beneath the earth, rhythmic and hollow, like knuckles against a window. By the second day, they'd unearthed something that silenced everyone: a ring of stone figures, worn by time but unmistakably human, their hands linked in a perfect circle. At the center lay a hollow depression, like the imprint of something that had once pressed upward, now gone. The mayor called in university researchers. The army fenced off the area. But the old families, the ones whose grandparents had lived through 1934, gathered along the ridge and stared in silence. Because they recognized the formation. 5 figures. Handbound. Kneeling. The Villalbas had come home. Within days, the scientists reported something even stranger. The soil around the statues wasn't just frozen. It was unnaturally preserved, as though sealed in permafrost. No natural explanation fit. When one of the technicians took a core sample, the temperature at a meter deep dropped to -6 degrees Celsius, even though the surface read plus 37 degrees Celsius. But it wasn't the temperature that unsettled them. It was what they found in the ice. A handprint, pressed from below, human in shape, but longer, thinner, and facing upward. The excavation halted. The government intervened, citing archaeological sensitivity. The site was buried again under concrete within a week. Officially, it became a water retention project. Unofficially, locals knew better. Because 2 nights after the sealing, a fisherman named Julio Ramirez swore he saw mist rising from the riverbed, a white column twisting in the air, even under a cloudless sky. He fled, but when he turned back from the ridge, he saw 5 figures standing by the water, not moving, just waiting. And when dawn came, the frost returned. It spread across fences, windows, rooftops, a glittering veil that vanished as the sun rose, leaving only puddles and silence. Julio left San Pedro that same week. Others followed. Within a year, the population halved. Those who remained claimed that, during the coldest nights, you could still hear it, the faint crack of shifting ice, the soft rhythm of something knocking from beneath. And every so often, when the fog was heavy enough to cover the old bend, people said they saw a circle form in the mist. 5 shapes, still holding hands, still kneeling, still guarding whatever the river tried to bury. No one knows what the Villalbas faced that night in 1934, whether it was nature's cruelty, divine retribution, or something far older than the town itself. But the legend endures. The children are told not to play by the river. The locals cross themselves when the frost arrives early. And every generation adds a new verse to the same whispered prayer Clara once wrote in her diary. If we don't come back, don't open the river. The villagers obey, because sometimes silence is the only way to keep the river still.